He was a former U.S. Marine who came to the mountains to disappear from grief, not to find redemption. After his wife's death, the snow-covered hills were the only place quiet enough to survive the nights. But on one frozen road, during a blizzard that erased all witnesses, he saw something that stopped his heart. A female police officer and her loyal K-9 lay bound in the snow, bodies battered, breath fading into the storm. Her hand was clenched around a blood-stained recorder, still warm, still alive. Someone wanted them erased, silently, and the only man left to find them was the one who had sworn never to fight again. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Winter settled over Ridgefall like a held breath, heavy and unyielding, as snow fell thick enough to swallow sound and soften the world into something eerily still. Daniel Cross left the town at dusk, his old pickup climbing the narrow mountain road toward the isolated wooden house perched above the trees. At 46, Daniel carried himself with the rigid economy of a man shaped by years of discipline. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face cut by sharp lines, dark stubble rough along his jaw, and eyes the color of cold steel that had seen too much to ever fully rest. He was a former U.S. Marine, discharged under sealed records, a man who spoke little to others and even less to himself. 2 years earlier, his wife's slow death had hollowed him out, sanding down whatever softness remained, leaving behind a quiet, guarded man who avoided town whenever possible. The mountain was not home. It was refuge, a place where memories echoed less loudly. The road twisted through dense pine forest, headlights carving narrow tunnels through swirling snow. Daniel drove carefully, hands steady on the wheel, mind deliberately empty. He had learned long ago that silence could be controlled if you did not let your thoughts wander. As the truck rounded a bend near the tree line, his headlights caught something wrong, a shape where no shape should be. He eased off the gas, instincts tightening in his chest before reason could follow. The shape resolved into two forms half buried by drifting snow, lying unnaturally close to the roadside. He stopped without hesitation. The cold hit hard when he stepped out, wind biting through his coat. Daniel approached slowly, boots crunching, every sense alert. The first figure was a woman, bound at the wrists with thick rope, her body angled awkwardly as if dropped rather than laid down. She was in her mid-30s, slender but strong in build, with pale skin bruised purple along her cheek and temple. Dark brown hair, cut just below the shoulders, was stiff with ice and blood, strands frozen to her face. Even unconscious, there was something resolute in the set of her jaw, a quiet defiance that had not been beaten out of her. Her uniform jacket, local police issue, was torn and soaked through, the fabric darkened where blood had seeped and frozen. Daniel recognized the signs immediately. This was not an accident, not exposure alone, but violence inflicted with intent. Beside her lay a German shepherd, a large male K-9 with a sable and black coat dulled by snow and grime. He was bound too, legs tied tightly, muscles trembling with the effort to stay upright. The dog was older, 6 or 7 by Daniel's estimate, his muzzle dusted with gray, eyes dark and intelligent even through pain and exhaustion. Despite his condition, the dog's body was angled protectively toward the woman, shoulder pressed close as if he could still shield her from harm. When Daniel knelt, the dog lifted his head with a low, warning growl that barely carried over the wind. Not aggression, but instinct. A final line drawn between his partner and the world. "Easy," Daniel murmured, voice calm and low, the same tone he had once used in darker places. He cut the ropes with a practiced motion, freeing the dog first, then the woman. Her pulse was weak, but present. Hypothermia had already begun its quiet work. Time mattered now, and Daniel did not allow himself to question why this had happened, or who had done it. He lifted the woman carefully, surprised by how light she felt, and then coaxed the dog into the truck, bracing his weight against the seat. The shepherd resisted only long enough to ensure the woman was coming too. Back in the cab, Daniel turned the heater to full and drove hard up the mountain, snow thickening as night closed in. The woman remained unconscious, breath shallow. The dog pressed close, his head resting against her leg, eyes never leaving her face. When they reached the cabin, Daniel carried them inside, one by one, laying the woman near the fire and wrapping her in heavy blankets. The dog collapsed beside her, body rigid with pain, but still alert enough to lift his head whenever Daniel moved too close. It was then that Daniel noticed her hand. Her fingers were clenched around a small black digital recorder, the casing smeared with dried blood. The red light on its side blinked faintly, still recording, still alive in the silence of the cabin. Daniel froze, a familiar tension sliding into place beneath his ribs. Evidence. A message. A trap, perhaps. He had learned the cost of listening at the wrong moment. Gently, without prying the device from her grasp, he reached out and pressed the button, silencing it. Whatever truth it held could wait. People could not. As the fire crackled and the storm howled outside, Daniel focused on what was in front of him. A wounded police officer he did not know, a loyal K-9 who refused to stand down, and a road that had delivered them to his door without witnesses. He told himself this was temporary, that he would hand them over to authorities once the storm passed. But deep down, as he watched the recorder's red light fade, Daniel Cross already knew that the mountain had not given him peace. It had given him a choice. The cabin breathed slowly through the night, wood popping in the stove as snow piled higher against the windows, sealing the world outside. Daniel Cross moved with deliberate care, the way men do when they've learned that haste costs lives. He worked in the dim amber light, cutting away frozen fabric, checking circulation, rubbing warmth back into skin that had gone dangerously pale. Emily Carter lay wrapped in blankets near the fire, her breathing shallow and uneven, lashes crusted with ice melt, lips tinged blue. Up close, Daniel could see the fine lines of strain around her eyes, the kind that came from long nights and decisions made too fast under pressure. She was built lean and athletic, not tall, but compact and resilient. Even unconscious, her body held tension, as if sleep were a temporary truce rather than surrender. Shadow refused to leave her side. The German shepherd lay curled close, chest rising with a wet rasp, one hind leg stiff and drawn inward. His coat, once glossy, was dulled by blood and snow, but his eyes, dark, watchful, intelligent, tracked Daniel's every movement. Each time Daniel stepped too close, the dog lifted his head and issued a low, warning rumble, not loud enough to be aggressive, just enough to be understood. Shadow was not feral or panicked. He was focused, disciplined, trained to protect one person and one person only. Daniel respected that. He adjusted his approach, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible, speaking softly when he needed to shift a blanket or adjust the fire. Trust, he knew, could not be forced. Hours passed, measured only by the stove's rhythm and the storm's unrelenting hiss. Daniel changed out wet towels, checked Emily's pulse again and again, and fed small amounts of warm water into Shadow's mouth with a syringe from an old field kit he kept for emergencies. The dog tolerated it, eyes never leaving Emily's face. Somewhere past midnight, the wind eased just enough for the silence to feel heavier rather than calmer. That was when Daniel finally looked at the recorder. It lay on the small table near the couch, black plastic scuffed and smeared with blood that had dried into dark flakes along the edge. He had set it there earlier without listening, a conscious choice, the kind that went against every instinct drilled into him. Information mattered, evidence mattered, but people mattered more. And he had learned, through loss he did not speak of, that once you heard something, you could not unhear it. Daniel picked up the device now, turning it in his hand, weighing it like a loaded weapon. The red light was off. He hesitated, then pressed play. At first there was only wind, a hollow roar, then footsteps crunching through snow. A woman's breathing cut in, ragged, controlled with effort. Emily's voice, stripped of authority and reduced to endurance, came through in fragments. If anyone hears this. A pause, another breath, forced, steady. Don't trust anyone in the department. The words were careful, measured, as if she knew every syllable might be the last she could choose. They're moving through the back roads, service trails. Places no one checks in winter. A sound like fabric scraping, then a sharp intake of breath, pain breaking through restraint. If someone finds me, don't bring me back to town. The house on the North Ridge, the cabin above the old switchback, it was flagged. Not the man, the place. Daniel's jaw tightened. He stopped the recording, thumb pressing down harder than necessary. The room felt smaller now, walls leaning in as if the cabin itself had heard and remembered. She hadn't said his name. She hadn't needed to. Emily Carter had known about the cabin long before tonight, known it as a location, a coordinate, a point of interest on a map. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath fogging in the cool air. That changed things. Shadow shifted, a faint whine slipping from his throat. Emily stirred for the first time since they'd arrived, her brow creasing, fingers twitching as if searching for something that wasn't there. Daniel moved instinctively, kneeling beside her, careful not to crowd. "Easy," he said quietly, not sure if she could hear him. Shadow pressed closer, his body a living barrier, and Daniel stopped short, hands open, waiting. The dog's growl subsided but did not disappear. Emily's eyes fluttered, unfocused, pupils blown wide by cold and shock. She did not wake fully, not yet, but her lips parted as if she were trying to speak, a soundless effort that cost her more than it should have. Daniel checked her pulse again, felt it strengthen just a fraction. Progress, fragile but real. He stood and walked to the window, peering out through frost-laced glass. The North Ridge disappeared into darkness, the road erased by snow. The cabin had been flagged, Emily had said. Investigated, noted, remembered. Daniel thought of the years he'd spent choosing places like this. High ground, limited access, isolation mistaken for safety. He had believed that distance equaled invisibility. The recorder suggested otherwise. Behind him the stove crackled, and Shadow let out a soft, exhausted huff, settling his head against the edge of the couch. Daniel turned back, looking at the unlikely trio bound together by weather and violence and timing. He had told himself this was temporary, that once the storm passed he would call it in, hand Emily over to people whose job it was to deal with things like this. But Emily's words echoed now, sharp and unyielding. Don't trust anyone in the department, not the man, the place. Daniel picked up the recorder again and slid it into the pocket of his jacket, close to his chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished with him. And for the first time since he'd driven up the mountains seeking quiet, Daniel Cross understood that silence had never been the same as safety. The cabin breathed slowly through the night, wood popping in the stove as snow piled higher against the windows, sealing the world outside. Daniel Cross moved with deliberate care, the way men do when they've learned that haste costs lives. He worked in the dim, amber light, cutting away frozen fabric, checking circulation, rubbing warmth back into skin that had gone dangerously pale. Emily Carter lay wrapped in blankets near the fire, her breathing shallow and uneven, lashes crusted with ice melt, lips tinged blue. Up close, Daniel could see the fine lines of strain around her eyes, the kind that came from long nights and decisions made too fast under pressure. She was built lean and athletic, not tall, but compact and resilient. Even unconscious, her body held tension, as if sleep were a temporary truce rather than surrender. Shadow refused to leave her side. The German Shepherd lay curled close, chest rising with a wet rasp, one hind leg stiff and drawn inward. His coat, once glossy, was dulled by blood and snow, but his eyes, dark, watchful, intelligent, tracked Daniel's every movement. Each time Daniel stepped too close, the dog lifted his head and issued a low, warning rumble, not loud enough to be aggressive, just enough to be understood. Shadow was not feral or panicked. He was focused, disciplined, trained to protect one person and one person only. Daniel respected that. He adjusted his approach, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible, speaking softly when he needed to shift a blanket or adjust the fire. Trust, he knew, could not be forced. Hours passed, measured only by the stove's rhythm and the storm's unrelenting hiss. Daniel changed out wet towels, checked Emily's pulse again and again, and fed small amounts of warm water into Shadow's mouth with a syringe from an old field kit he kept for emergencies. The dog tolerated it, eyes never leaving Emily's face. Somewhere past midnight, the wind eased just enough for the silence to feel heavier rather than calmer. That was when Daniel finally looked at the recorder. It lay on the small table near the couch, black plastic scuffed and smeared with blood that had dried into dark flakes along the edge. He had set it there earlier without listening, a conscious choice, the kind that went against every instinct drilled into him. Information mattered, evidence mattered, but people mattered more. And he had learned, through loss he did not speak of, that once you heard something, you could not unhear it. Daniel picked up the device now, turning it in his hand, weighing it like a loaded weapon. The red light was off. He hesitated, then pressed play. At first there was only wind, a hollow roar, then footsteps crunching through snow. A woman's breathing cut in, ragged, controlled with effort. Emily's voice, stripped of authority and reduced to endurance, came through in fragments. If anyone hears this... A pause. Another breath, forced, steady. Don't trust anyone in the department. The words were careful, measured, as if she knew every syllable might be the last she could choose. They're moving through the back roads, service trails. Places no one checks in winter. A sound like fabric scraping, then a sharp intake of breath, pain breaking through restraint. If someone finds me, don't bring me back to town. The house on the North Ridge, the cabin above the old switchback, it was flagged. Not the man, the place. Daniel's jaw tightened. He stopped the recording, thumb pressing down harder than necessary. The room felt smaller now, walls leaning in as if the cabin itself had heard and remembered. She hadn't said his name. She hadn't needed to. Emily Carter had known about the cabin long before tonight, known it as a location, a coordinate, a point of interest on a map. Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath fogging in the cool air. That changed things. Shadow shifted, a faint whine slipping from his throat. Emily stirred for the first time since they'd arrived, her brow creasing, fingers twitching as if searching for something that wasn't there. Daniel moved instinctively, kneeling beside her, careful not to crowd. "Easy," he said quietly, not sure if she could hear him. Shadow pressed closer, his body a living barrier, and Daniel stopped short, hands open, waiting. The dog's growl subsided but did not disappear. Emily's eyes fluttered, unfocused, pupils blown wide by cold and shock. She did not wake fully, not yet, but her lips parted as if she were trying to speak, a soundless effort that cost her more than it should have. Daniel checked her pulse again, felt it strengthen just a fraction. Progress, fragile but real. He stood and walked to the window, peering out through frost-laced glass. The North Ridge disappeared into darkness, the road erased by snow. The cabin had been flagged, Emily had said. Investigated, noted, remembered. Daniel thought of the years he'd spent choosing places like this. High ground, limited access, isolation mistaken for safety. He had believed that distance equaled invisibility. The recorder suggested otherwise. Behind him, the stove crackled, and Shadow let out a soft, exhausted huff, settling his head against the edge of the couch. Daniel turned back, looking at the unlikely trio bound together by weather and violence and timing. He had told himself this was temporary, that once the storm passed he would call it in, hand Emily over to people whose job it was to deal with things like this. But Emily's words echoed now, sharp and unyielding. Don't trust anyone in the department, not the man, the place. Daniel picked up the recorder again and slid it into the pocket of his jacket, close to his chest. Whatever this was, it wasn't finished with him. And for the first time since he'd driven up the mountain seeking quiet, Daniel Cross understood that silence had never been the same as safety. By late afternoon, the snow had settled into a deceptive calm. A clean, white skin stretched tight over the mountain. Daniel Cross stood at the back window, watching the tree line with the stillness of a man who had learned to read absence as carefully as presence. The cabin was quiet, except for the soft rasp of Shadow's breathing and the low tick of cooling metal from the stove. Emily Carter rested on the couch, propped up with blankets, her injured shoulder immobilized, her eyes alert despite the pain that tightened her mouth whenever she shifted. She had the look of someone who hated being still, lean and compact, dark hair pulled back in a rough tie, skin still pale from cold and shock. Waiting, Daniel knew, was harder for her than running. Shadow broke the silence first. The German shepherd lifted his head, ears angling toward the north slope, the muscles along his back drawing taut beneath his thick sable coat. A low growl vibrated in his chest, more felt than heard. Daniel didn't move. He listened, not with his ears, but with the quiet awareness that had kept him alive in places where sound lied. A moment later, he caught it too. A distant engine note, faint and intermittent, carried on the cold air and then swallowed by the terrain. "Someone's moving," Emily said quietly. It wasn't a question. Shadow rose and limped to the back door, positioning himself squarely in front of it, head lowered, nostrils flaring as he sampled the air through the narrow gap beneath the frame. He did not bark. He did not scratch. He simply stood there, immovable, a living barricade. Daniel watched him with a measured respect. This wasn't panic. This was recognition. Daniel slipped on his boots and eased the door open just enough to step outside, careful to leave Shadow inside where he could still guard Emily. The cold bit immediately, sharp and clean. He circled the cabin slowly, eyes scanning the snow. It didn't take long to find what Shadow already knew. Near the tree line, the pristine surface was disturbed, subtle but unmistakable. A line where the snow had compacted differently. Fresh boot prints, the tread pattern deep enough to suggest weight, not the light scatter of an animal. Daniel crouched, brushing snow aside with a gloved hand. The edges were crisp. Recent. A few yards downslope, another sign waited. Beneath a thin drift, a set of tire marks curved away from the service road, heavy and wide, the kind left by a pickup truck with a reinforced rear axle. Someone had come up here and left again, confident enough to get close, careful enough to think the snow would erase them. Daniel straightened, the old calculation clicking into place. This wasn't curiosity. This was surveillance. When he returned inside, Shadow was already moving, nose low, following a path only he could read. The dog crossed the cabin and began pawing at the snow piled against the side wall near the woodshed. Daniel grabbed a shovel and joined him, working carefully. Emily watched from the couch, her face drawn, her eyes fixed on the spot Shadow refused to abandon. The dog dug with urgency, ignoring the pull of his injured leg, breath coming in short bursts. His paw struck metal with a dull sound. Daniel cleared the last of the snow and froze. A police badge lay half buried in the dirt, bent sharply at the center, the enamel cracked. It wasn't dropped. It had been forced. Daniel picked it up, turning it so the light caught the engraved name. He didn't need to read it aloud. Emily did that for him. "That's Lieutenant Harris," she said, her voice steady but flat. She was a tall woman when she stood, Daniel remembered from the road, but now she looked smaller, pressed back by the weight of the realization settling in her chest. Harris was in his late 40s, broad-faced with a permanent 5 o'clock shadow and a practiced, easy smile that put people at ease. He was known around Ridgefall as reliable, approachable, the kind of man who shook hands with everyone and remembered your kids' names. He'd trained half the department. He'd signed off on Emily's assignments. Shadow sat back on his haunches, watching her, head tilted slightly as if waiting for instruction. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, something hard and clear taking shape behind the pain. "They didn't leave me out there to die," she said, slowly. "Not really." Daniel understood before she finished. "They wanted to see who came." Emily nodded. "They wanted to know if anyone would break pattern, if I was still connected to anything worth pulling out of the dark." She looked at the badge in Daniel's hand. "Harris knew the cabin mattered. He knew where I was headed. And he knew someone like you wouldn't call it in right away." Daniel felt the old anger stir, not hot, but focused. He set the badge on the table, away from Emily's reach, as if distance might blunt the truth. "If they're watching," he said, "they'll come back." "They already have," Emily replied. "This," she gestured weakly toward the window, the tracks, the badge, was them checking the hook. Her gaze flicked to Shadow, who had resumed his post by the back door, every line of his body set toward the woods. And he smelled them. Shadow's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. He gave a single, quiet huff, then went still again, eyes locked on the darkening tree line. Daniel met Emily's gaze, the unspoken agreement forming between them. She hadn't been abandoned. She'd been bait. And now, the line was tight. Emily realized with certainty that the ambush had been designed to draw someone out, and that she was never meant to disappear, only to be followed. The storm returned on the third night with intent, wind slamming into the cabin as if the mountain itself were trying to tear the place loose. Snow moved sideways, thick and blinding, erasing distance and sound. Daniel Cross had expected it. 2 days of quiet after the signs meant only one thing. They were done watching. He moved through the cabin with a calm that came from habit rather than hope, checking windows, cutting lights, clearing angles of approach he'd memorized the first year he'd lived here. Emily Carter sat upright on the couch, jacket pulled tight, her injured shoulder bound and braced. Pain sharpened her features, but didn't slow her thinking. She watched Daniel with steady eyes, reading his movements like a language she recognized. Shadow paced near the back door, every step measured, despite the stiffness in his leg. The German Shepherd's coat had been cleaned and dried, the sable fur dark and dense again, but the injury pulled his gait uneven. He paused, head cocked, ears forward. Then he went still. Not a growl this time, a deeper, alert, silent, and absolute. "They're here," Emily said softly. Daniel nodded and killed the stove's fan, letting the crackle die. He took position near the rear hallway, a narrow space that forced anyone entering to commit. Outside, the wind masked everything. Footsteps, voices, even breath. That was the point. Whoever had planned this knew the mountain, knew storms, knew when law thinned to nothing. There would be no sirens tonight. The first breach didn't come at the door. A window shattered on the north side, glass blowing inward with the snow. 2 figures slid through low and fast, their movements economical, weapons up but disciplined. They wore winter gear stripped of insignia, faces covered, posture trained. They didn't fire. They moved to corners, clearing, signaling with hand motions that cut through the dark. A third figure took the back approach, circling wide to draw attention away from the main entry. Shadow launched before Daniel could stop him. The dog burst through the back door in a blur of muscle and fur, a controlled explosion of intent. He ran not toward the nearest man, but past him, angling wide, barking once, sharp, commanding, forcing heads to turn, lines of fire to shift. It worked. Someone cursed. A rifle snapped up too late. The crack of the shot was swallowed by the storm, but the impact wasn't. Shadow yelped, momentum breaking as he slid across the snow, a dark stain blooming beneath him. "No!" Emily shouted, pushing forward before pain dragged her back. Daniel moved without thought. He was outside, rifle up, using the tree line for cover, breath slow, heart steady. He fired twice, not to kill, but to pin, to force space. The attackers responded in kind, controlled bursts meant to suppress rather than end. They were not here to slaughter, they were here to retrieve. A voice cut through the chaos, close and familiar, carried on the wind with the ease of habit. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." The tone was calm, almost weary. Daniel froze, recognition slicing clean through adrenaline. He knew that cadence. He'd heard it years ago, shouted over rotors and rain, spoken quietly after things went wrong. The man stepped into a gap in the trees, weapon lowered just enough to signal intent. He was tall and rangy, mid-30s, beard grown rough and uneven, eyes sharp beneath a knit cap pulled low. There was an old scar tracing his cheekbone, pale against wind-burned skin. His name surfaced in Daniel's mind with unwanted clarity. Mark Ellison, former infantry, discharged after a disciplinary incident that never quite matched the rumors. Daniel had pulled him out once, dragged him clear under fire, taken a piece of shrapnel meant for him. They hadn't spoken since. "You shouldn't be here," Ellison said, voice raised only enough to carry. "This doesn't have to end ugly." Daniel advanced a step, weapon steady. "You shot my dog." Ellison's jaw tightened, something flickering there. Regret, maybe, or calculation. "He'll live," he said. "My aim's to stop, same as tonight." Behind them, movement at the cabin drew Ellison's attention for half a second too long. Daniel took it, shifting position, forcing Ellison back into cover. The exchange stayed measured, precise. No wildfire, no panic. Inside, Emily crawled to Shadow, hands shaking as she pressed pressure into the wound, whispering to him with the fierce tenderness of someone who refused to lose another thing tonight. "They don't want you dead," Ellison called again, closer now, using the trees like old friends. "They want what you're holding." "The recorder, that's it. Hand it over, and we're gone." Daniel felt the truth of it settle in his bones. They could have burned the cabin. They could have ended this in seconds. They hadn't. He glanced toward the door, toward Emily's pale face framed in shadow, Shadow's dark eyes locked on him even through pain. "You sold out," Daniel said. Not accusation, confirmation. Ellison exhaled, breath fogging. "I got recruited," he replied. "Same as always. You fall out of the system, someone else picks you up. This isn't personal." Daniel almost laughed at that. Almost. The wind howled, erasing the space between heartbeats. He did not lower his weapon. He did not move to the pocket where the recorder rested, warm against his chest. A flare of light burst downslope, an extraction signal. Ellison hesitated, then stepped back, retreating into the storm with practiced ease. "Think about it," he said, voice fading. "Next time, they won't miss." The attackers vanished as they'd come, leaving only broken glass, trampled snow, and the copper tang of blood. Daniel ran to Shadow, dropping to his knees as Emily held the dog's head, her hands slick and steady. Shadow's breathing was shallow but strong. alive. For now. Daniel looked out into the white void where Ellison had disappeared. The recorder remained where it was. They hadn't come to kill him. They'd come to take back a voice. And they would be back. Daniel realized the attackers were under strict orders not to kill him, only to recover the recorder, confirming that the truth it held mattered more than any life on the mountain tonight. Morning came without color. The storm had burned itself out during the night, leaving the mountain suspended in a brittle, white silence that felt unnatural after violence. The cabin stood scarred but upright, windows boarded, snow drifted high against the walls as if trying to bury what had happened. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic, gun oil, and damp wood. Daniel Cross sat at the small kitchen table, shoulders heavy, hands wrapped around a mug he hadn't drunk from. Across the room, Emily Carter worked with slow precision, her movements careful but determined, the kind of control born from pain and discipline rather than comfort. Emily looked different in daylight. In her mid-30s, she was tall and lean, with sharp cheekbones and ash-blonde hair cut short enough to stay out of her eyes. Her skin was pale, drawn tight by exhaustion, but her gaze remained steady, gray, observant, unflinching. This was a woman used to carrying truth alone. Her shoulder was still immobilized, her posture slightly off balance, yet her mind was already 3 steps ahead of the moment. Shadow lay near the hearth, his breathing shallow but even. The German shepherd's dark eyes followed Emily whenever she moved, loyalty overriding pain. His age, nearly 7, showed in the silver threading his muzzle, but his presence still radiated resolve. Emily set the recorder on the table between them. The casing was scratched, a smear of dried blood dark against the plastic. Daniel had avoided touching it since the attack. Now it felt heavier than any weapon he'd carried. Emily plugged it into a small, encrypted transmitter she'd salvaged from her coat lining, hands steady despite the tremor that lived just beneath her skin. "I can't sit on this anymore," she said quietly. "If they come back, it won't be for intimidation." She paused, eyes lifting to Daniel. "It'll be cleanup." Daniel nodded once. He didn't argue. He'd learned long ago when words were useless. Emily began the transfer, sending compressed audio files and time-stamped logs toward a federal relay she trusted, one that didn't belong to her department. The process took minutes, but the silence stretched longer. When the confirmation light blinked green, Emily closed her eyes, exhaling like someone setting down a weight she'd carried for too long. "It's done," she said. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they opened a door Daniel hadn't realized he'd been bracing against. He stood and crossed the room, retrieving a small metal box from a shelf near the window. He set it on the table, sliding it toward her. Inside were old hospital forms, folded and yellowed, names circled in his wife's careful handwriting. "My wife," Daniel said, voice low. "Her name was Sarah." Emily looked up, waiting. "Sarah Cross was a nurse administrator at the regional hospital," he continued. "Not frontline. Paperwork, transfers, supply logs." His jaw tightened. Sarah had been small, barely 5'4", with warm brown skin that freckled easily in summer, and long, dark hair she kept braided over one shoulder. She'd been gentle with people, stubborn with systems. Stress never showed on her face until it was already too late. She noticed irregularities, Daniel said. Medical transport requests that didn't match patient records. Ambulances logged for equipment relocation at odd hours. She flagged them internally. He swallowed. A week later, anonymous complaints started. Then threats. Nothing explicit enough to report. Just enough to make her doubt herself. Emily's expression shifted, recognition tightening her features. Her anxiety spiked, Daniel went on. Migraines, panic attacks. Doctors called it burnout. Then autoimmune complications. Everything spiraled fast. He looked down at his hands. By the time we realized something was seriously wrong, the damage was done. Emily reached for the papers, scanning them. "These transport routes," she said slowly. "They overlap with what I was investigating." "Remote handoffs disguised as medical logistics." Daniel nodded. She never knew the full picture, but she knew enough to scare someone. The truth settled between them with cruel clarity. Daniel hadn't been pulled into this by chance. He'd been orbiting it for years, blind to the shape of it until now. His retreat to the mountain, his disappearance from records after Sarah's death, had not erased him. It had preserved him. Emily leaned back carefully, pain flashing across her face before discipline smothered it. "Someone accessed your sealed file," she said. "Not recently." "Years ago. Quietly. They knew you weren't dead. They just waited." Daniel felt the cold realization lock into place. He hadn't surfaced by accident. His presence here, his visibility, had been anticipated. The recorder, the ambush, Emily left alive in the snow. It wasn't sloppiness. It was bait. "They wanted me to come back into the light," Daniel said. Emily met his gaze. "Yes." Shadow shifted, letting out a low sound that wasn't a growl but something deeper. Unease, perhaps, or recognition. Daniel knelt beside him, resting a hand on the dog's broad head. The fur was warm beneath his palm, alive, still fighting. Emily closed the metal box and slid it back toward Daniel. "Your wife wasn't collateral," she said softly. "She was an obstacle." Daniel stood slowly, the room seeming smaller now, tighter. He had spent years believing his grief was private, random, meaningless in the grand scheme of violence he'd escaped. Now he understood the shape of it. The line had never been broken. It had simply curved back toward him. Outside, the mountain remained silent, indifferent. Inside, the truth had finally finished forming. Daniel realizes the mole inside the police department has known for years that he was alive, and deliberately waited for him to reappear, making this confrontation inevitable. The federal presence arrived quietly, without sirens or spectacle, the way serious things often do. Unmarked vehicles climbed the mountain road at dawn, tires crunching through old snow, engines cut long before they reached the cabin. Men and women stepped out in winter coats that hid credentials and intent, their movements efficient, faces composed. Daniel watched from the porch, breath fogging the air, hands relaxed at his sides. He recognized the posture. Not hunters, not tourists. Professionals who understood that restraint was its own language. Emily Carter stood a few steps behind him, wrapped in a heavy coat borrowed from the cabin. In the pale morning light, the lines of exhaustion on her face were unmistakable, but so was the clarity in her eyes. She had been briefed during the night, codes exchanged, names confirmed. Witness protection was not an escape. It was a corridor, narrow, controlled, and watched from both ends. She accepted it without ceremony. Survival to her had never been about comfort. Shadow lay near the door, bandaged flank rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. He would live. The veterinarian flown in under federal cover had been blunt. The damage would never fully heal. A permanent limp, reduced endurance. But the dog's eyes were bright, alert, fixed on Emily whenever she shifted. Loyalty did not require perfection. It required presence. A woman approached Emily with a quiet authority that came from practice. Her name was Rachel Moore, mid-40s, tall and angular, dark hair pulled back tight enough to reveal a face shaped by long hours and longer decisions. Her skin bore the faint lines of wind and worry, her voice calm, unadorned. She explained procedures, timelines, contingencies, never once raising her tone. Emily listened, nodded, asked precise questions. Two professionals measuring trust not by warmth, but by accuracy. Daniel stayed out of it. He had given his statement the night before, concise, factual, stripped of speculation. He had handed over the recorder, the hospital forms, everything Sarah had left behind. The agents had not pressed him to leave. They did not ask him to come along. They understood something about terrain and about men who chose it. By mid-morning, Emily was ready. She knelt beside Shadow, resting her forehead against his, whispering words Daniel did not hear. When she stood, her posture wavered for a moment, then steadied. She faced Daniel, eyes searching his face as if memorizing a landscape she might never see again. "They'll try to convince you to disappear," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "I already did that once." She held his gaze. There was gratitude there, unspoken and heavy, and something else, recognition. "You don't owe anyone anything," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm staying." Emily studied him for a long moment, then extended her hand. Daniel took it, grip firm, uncomplicated. When she turned away, Shadow let out a low sound. Not a whine, not a bark. Acknowledgement. The vehicles rolled down the mountain, carrying truth wrapped in procedures and promises. Silence followed. Days passed. Snow softened, then hardened again under cold nights. The town of Ridgefall buzzed with rumor and restraint. No names were released, no statements confirmed. But doors closed more carefully. Conversations ended sooner. The road Daniel watched grew quieter, then busier, then quiet again. Patterns changed. That mattered. Shadow healed slowly. He learned new ways to stand, to pivot, to rest without surrendering vigilance. Daniel adapted with him, walks shorter, rests longer. The dog's limp became a marker, not of weakness, but of history. They shared it without ceremony. Letters arrived, federal seals, brief updates. An investigation widened. Administrative leaves were taken. Indictments whispered about before they were spoken aloud. Daniel read the letters once, then burned them in the stove. He kept what mattered in memory, where it belonged. On clear mornings, he stood on the porch and looked down the road that curved out of sight, the one people used when they thought no one was watching. He did not carry a weapon openly. He did not set traps. He maintained the place, fixed boards, cleared snow, made coffee for no one in particular. Peace, he had learned, was not the absence of threat. It was the presence of care. Sometimes, at dusk, he thought of Sarah, of her small, stubborn handwriting circling numbers that did not add up, of the way she had believed systems could be corrected if someone was patient enough to point at the flaw. He did not romanticize her death anymore. He honored her attention. Shadow would sit beside him, tail resting on the boards, eyes following the road. They did not speak of guarding. They simply remained. Daniel Cross did not leave Ridgefall. He stayed in the house on the hill, not to hide, but to witness. To be the man who noticed when patterns shifted, to be the quiet constant that made certain paths less safe for lies. Peace, he understood now, was not running. It was choosing where to stand. And there were footprints the snow could never erase. Someone only had to be brave enough to stop and see them. Sometimes the miracle does not arrive as a sudden rescue or a loud sign from heaven. Sometimes it comes quietly, through endurance, through the choice to stay when it would be easier to run. God does not always remove the storm, but He places someone strong enough to stand inside it. In our daily lives, we face roads with no witnesses, moments when no one sees our struggle, our integrity, or our pain. Yet nothing is unseen by Him. Every step matters. Every act of courage leaves a mark no snow can erase. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and unseen miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and walk beside you, always.